Want to see Mars but can't afford commercial space travel? Perhaps there is another option. Perhaps you could train to be an astronaut, fly into space and then jump from your space station to Mars and float the rest of the way for free. Perhaps not. Isn't it, in fact, a rather frightening thought to be drifting off into the void of space where you won't be able to survive and more than likely won't be able to return? So let's see what would happen if you lost your grasp or misplaced a step when up in the sky. So, what happens if an astronaut gets separated from the rest of the crew in space? There are a few possible consequences, none of which are appealing. The fate of an astronaut is determined by the angle at which they fall. They could be left floating or possibly spinning in space until their oxygen tank ran out, resulting in asphyxiation and death. Alternatively, you could float into the Earth's atmosphere and be practically roasted alive. Guess what? If you have a choice for how you want to proceed, you can do it. Physical laws and gravity are unconcerned. You won't be able to change your direction no matter how much you flap your limbs. Your fate has already been decided for you once you've floated away from the station. So, losing communication with the space station is a little more expensive than letting go of a balloon in the wind. How do astronauts avoid taking a stroll in the cosmic park when there is such a high risk involved? How do astronauts prevent their spacecraft from floating away? Tethers and safers are used by astronauts to keep them from floating away into space. Tethers are the wires that keep them connected, while safers are a backup system, similar to a jetpack that allows an astronaut to blast oneself back if necessary. You aren't sent into space to lounge around in your spacecraft and gaze at the stars. Astronauts must not only conduct study, but also install equipment and make repairs outside the spacecraft. As a result, departing the spacecraft is a critical task that must be carried out with extreme caution. Fortunately for the astronauts, they are not trusted to navigate the ship like a freehand rock climber attempting to scale a mountain. They are given a variety of gadgets to aid them in their efforts to avoid floating off into space. Astronauts are given tethers as the first piece of equipment to keep them connected to their spacecraft. The astronaut suit and the spacecraft are connected via tethers, which are long cables. The tether keeps an astronaut from getting too far away from the ship and allows them to quickly return after the mission is done. And as impressive as they may appear, they're basically just cables. A safer gadget is another device used to safeguard astronauts from floating away in space. This gadget functions similarly to a jetpack, allowing the astronaut to fly back to safety if they become separated from their tether. The safer is controlled by astronauts using a joystick control panel. When it comes to finding a cost-effective way to Mars, a joyride on the safer is not an option. You'll have to save enough for the commercial space voyage ticket, I'm afraid. What are astronauts taught to do if they become disoriented in space? Trainee astronauts go through a rigorous training regime to learn how to properly execute spacewalks, also known as extravehicular activities, so that floating off into space is never a possibility. Astronauts are acclimatized to the lack of gravity through training in situations that mimic the conditions of space. Astronauts can perform spacewalks in training simulations this manner, gaining a significant amount of experience functioning in a floaty environment. The astronaut, on the other hand, would be without a means of returning to the spacecraft if the safer was defective or if they'd forgotten to wear it that day. And, as we've already discussed, the astronaut will have no control over the direction in which they float. You can't swim back, since it's not like water. Then is when things start to get a little complicated. In such a case, the astronaut's spacecraft colleagues would have to undertake a rescue operation. Another astronaut would be required to link many tethers in order for the astronaut to be able to haul themselves back in. If a floating astronaut was knocked unconscious, their colleague would have to use the tethers as well as their safer to return them back to the spacecraft. There is a reason why such a mission has yet to take place. Astronautic missions to the stars, discoveries in the unknown, and questions about our own existence are all possibilities. If any of these intrigue you, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, Facts Pulse, and continue your exploration of the vastness of the universe. Is there anyone who has floated off in space? So far, the answer is no. except for George Clooney's floaty excursion in the 2013 film Gravity. No one has ever needed to be rescued from floating off into space since no one has ever been exposed to such a terrifying experience. However, there have been several near calls. Georgy Grechko, a Soviet cosmonaut, began to drift away from his ship shortly after releasing his tether in 1977. Fortunately, his commander, who happened to be nearby, was able to grab Grechko's leg and pull him back to his spaceship. Grechko owed his captain an enormous drink after he changed his space diaper. It's safe to say, for the sake of a fantastic photo opportunity, one astronaut went to great lengths. Bruce McCandless, a US astronaut, was the first to float freely in space without being attached to his ship in 1984. Bruce was photographed floating quietly above Earth in a famous photograph, but how did he return? Bruce, on the other hand, was utilizing an MMU, Manned Maneuvering Unit, which allowed him to do extravehicular activities untethered as long as he stayed near to the spacecraft. NASA used the MMU on 3 trips before deciding that it was too risky to use and retired it. Is it possible to stop floating in space? Because there's no gravity in space, you can't stop floating. It would be due to the abrupt presence of a gravitational center if we were to stop floating. For example, the Earth is a gravitational center. Because of gravity, we do not float when we are on Earth. When we're in space, Earth's gravitational pull on us is so faint that we drift around aimlessly. Other planets have gravity, but if Earth's isn't strong enough to drag us back down, Jupiter's isn't likely to be either, even if it is a much bigger planet. If there was enough gravity in space, a central point would be required, whatever it was going to drag us down to it. There is no gravity in space, which is fortunate for the astronauts. They'd otherwise be hurtling towards the center at breakneck speed. Wait a minute, I watched that Red Bull guy jump from space and land on Earth. You might be thinking, how did he manage to stop floating and return to Earth? At first, he didn't seem to want to stop floating. We already know that if an astronaut floats off into space, one possible conclusion is that they will crash into the Earth's atmosphere and be burnt alive. This is because, despite the lack of gravity in space, Earth nonetheless exerts a gravitational pull on nearby objects. The level of gravity would grow as the space jumper got closer to Earth. He would eventually stop floating and begin to sink to the surface at a considerably faster rate due to the strong presence of gravity. Why didn't he suffer the dreadful tragedy that was predicted for him? This was something that Red Bull had planned for. The jumper was protected from the sudden shift in air pressure by a pressurized suit. So, how does anything stay up in space for an extended period of time if items always float in space yet always return to Earth? Because of Earth's gravitational pull, the spacecrafts that astronauts work on are continually descending towards it. The spacecrafts, however, never strike the Earth because of the incredible speed with which they orbit the Earth. Finally, floating into space is an unavoidable job hazard when working amid the stars. Astronauts are terrified of something like this happening. Even non-astronauts who have seen gravity are likely to have nightmares about it happening to us. Fortunately, at this point, the only place an astronaut has been documented floating out into space is on a movie screen. Hopefully, it will continue to be so. Because of technological advancements, astronauts can now be a little more careless, knowing that they can just jetpack back to safety. Even yet, if you find yourself floating in space, don't go exploring. Thanks for watching, and we'd love to keep you updated on all our future videos. So hit the subscribe button and the bell icon to be a part of our Facts Pulse family.